By the time they stopped guessing and started looking deeper, the situation had already changed in a way none of them fully understood yet. What began as a quiet sense of unease had turned into something more structured, more deliberate. It wasn't about how she spoke anymore, or the small inconsistencies in her stories. It was about whether anything she had said could actually be verified outside of her own words. The first instinct was to check the simplest details. People always start with what feels easiest to confirm, because it creates the illusion that truth can be found quickly. The school she mentioned was real. That part gave them a false sense of reassurance at first. It grounded her story in reality, but when they tried to confirm her presence there, things became less clear. There were records, but none that matched her exactly. Names that were similar, timelines that almost aligned, fragments that felt close enough to be believable, but never precise enough to confirm anything. It was like chasing something that had been intentionally blurred. That was the moment they understood this wasn't a careless lie. This wasn't someone making things up on the spot. This was constructed, carefully, thoughtfully. She hadn't invented a completely false life. That would have been easier to expose. Instead, she had built her identity using real pieces, slightly altered, just enough to survive basic questioning. It was a strategy designed to pass through the first level of doubt. Once they realized that, the way they approached everything changed. They stopped asking whether she was telling the truth, and started asking how the lie was built. That shift made the investigation deeper, more focused. Now they weren't looking for one mistake, they were looking for structure. They moved to the next layer, the people she mentioned, friends, connections, names that should exist in the real world beyond her version of them. At first it seemed promising. Some of the names were real. That created another illusion of credibility. But when they tried to connect those names back to her, the links didn't hold. The people existed, but they didn't know her. Others couldn't be found at all. It was inconsistent in a way that felt intentional. Enough truth to feel grounded, but not enough to be traced. That's when the discomfort shifted into something heavier. Because this wasn't just deception anymore. It was design. Every part of her story had been calibrated to exist just inside the boundary of believability, without ever crossing into something that could be confirmed. And that kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. Someone raised a question that hadn't been considered before, and when it was said out loud, it changed everything. What if this wasn't the first time? The room didn't react immediately, but the weight of that idea settled in quickly. Because if this was repeated behavior, then they weren't dealing with a situation, they were dealing with a pattern, and patterns imply experience. They expanded their search beyond her immediate story, not just what she said, but anything that could exist outside of her control. Online traces, old profiles, any digital footprint that could confirm a consistent identity over time. But what they found was almost more disturbing than finding nothing at all. There was almost no trace. And in a world where nearly everyone leaves some kind of digital footprint, that absence stood out more than any inconsistency. It wasn't natural. It didn't feel like privacy. It felt like removal. Like something had been cleaned, intentionally reduced, leaving only what was necessary to support the version of herself she presented. That's when they found the first real break. It wasn't directly tied to her, not clearly, but it was close enough to matter. A name that resembled one she had used before, slightly different, but similar enough to raise curiosity. When they followed that lead, they didn't find confirmation. They found something else. A story, from a different place, a different group of people, but with the same structure. Someone who appeared suddenly, integrated quickly, became trusted without resistance. And then, over time, small inconsistencies began to surface, not enough to alarm anyone immediately, but enough to create doubt. And before that doubt could fully form into confrontation, the person disappeared. No explanation, no closure, just absence. At first, it could have been coincidence, but when they compared the details more closely, the similarities became harder to ignore. The way she integrated, the way trust formed around her, the way the inconsistencies appeared gradually, not suddenly. It was too aligned to dismiss. That's when the fear became real. Because now they weren't asking if she was lying. They were asking how many times she had done this before. And that question didn't have an easy answer. It changed how they saw everything that had already happened. Every conversation they had with her now felt different. Not because the words had changed, but because the meaning behind them had shifted. What once felt natural now felt calculated. What once felt spontaneous now felt intentional. And the most unsettling part wasn't what she had done, it was how easily it had worked. Because none of them were careless, none of them believed they were easy to deceive, and yet they had accepted her completely, without needing proof. Not because they were naive, but because everything she did aligned with what they expected to see. That's what made it effective. She didn't force belief, she allowed it. And once belief is given freely, it's harder to take back. By the time they reached this point, the situation was no longer just about her, it was about themselves. About how they had responded, how they had trusted, how they had ignored the small signals that something wasn't right. That realization was more uncomfortable than anything she had said, because it meant the weakness wasn't just in her deception, it was in their perception. And once you recognize that, you can't unsee it. And that was the part none of them were prepared for. Not the lie itself, not even the possibility that she had done this before, but the realization that someone could step into people's lives so smoothly, so naturally, so convincingly, and never once feel out of place. She hadn't forced her way in. She hadn't manipulated people with obvious pressure or dramatic tricks. She had done something far more effective. She had simply become what everyone expected to see. And that is what made her so dangerous. Because by the time the truth started surfacing, the damage had already been done. Trust had already been built, stories had already been shared, defenses had already been lowered. And now, as investigators dug deeper into the name, the pattern, and the possibility that this wasn't an isolated deception, one question began hanging over everything else. If this wasn't the first time, then what happened the last time? Because people like this do not usually start with perfection. They refine it, they learn from mistakes, they get better. And if that was true here, then this story was no longer just about a fake identity. It was about a hidden past. A past that was beginning to point somewhere much darker. And the closer they got to that missing part of her life, the clearer it became that this case was about to turn into something far worse than anyone first imagined. Because pretending to be someone else was only the surface. What she was really hiding was still waiting to be found. If you want part 2, comment part 2 below, and subscribe now, because the next part is where the truth really begins.